In the summer of 1944, while the Allies celebrated the success of D-Day, many German officers still maintained an almost arrogant confidence on one specific point: logistics. For them, history had always been clear. Armies don't win solely through bravery or numbers, but through supplies, and in this they believed the United States was inexperienced, naive, and inefficient. German generals, trained in a military tradition that valued precision, rigid planning, and short campaigns, looked at maps of France and laughed at the idea that a mechanized army could advance hundreds of kilometers relying on destroyed ports, bombed roads, and an improvised supply chain. For them, the Allied advance after Normandy would be nothing more than a brief surge before an inevitable collapse caused not by German bullets, but by a lack of fuel, food, and ammunition. This conviction didn't come out of nowhere. Germany had won entire campaigns by exploiting precisely this type of logistical weakness in its enemies. In France in 1940, in North Africa, and in the first months of the invasion of the Soviet Union, breaking enemy supply lines was as lethal as any armored offensive. Now, observing the Allies pinned down on Normandy beaches, with ports like Cherbourg damaged and the great logistical prize, Antwerp, still distant, the Germans believed they were facing a classic mistake: how to supply hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and trucks via narrow, potholed roads under constant air attack. The math simply didn't add up, and for many German officers, when the math doesn't add up, war takes its toll. On the other side, however, there was a completely different mentality. For the Americans, logistics was not merely a support function, but a strategic weapon. While the Germans thought in terms of optimal efficiency, the United States thought in terms of volume, redundancy, and speed. Where European doctrine sought elegant and lean systems, the Americans bet on deliberate excess: more trucks than necessary, more fuel than estimated, more drivers than any manual would recommend. This philosophy stemmed directly from American industrial capacity, which transformed civilian factories into military production lines at a pace the Axis could never match. Yet even with all this capacity, the problem was real. The advance was too rapid, and the depots simply couldn't keep up. It was at this critical moment that a solution emerged that seemed absurd, even to many allies. A logistical operation based almost exclusively on trucks, running day and night, without rest, ignoring traffic rules, mechanical wear and tear, and human limitations. What began as an emergency measure quickly transformed into a vital artery, pumping fuel, ammunition, and supplies directly to the spearhead of the Allied advance. Entire roads were reserved solely for this continuous flow, creating an almost uninterrupted stream of vehicles advancing and returning like an artificial circulatory system. To the Germans, observing from the other side, it seemed too improvised to work for long. They were right about one thing: it wasn't sustainable in the long term. What they didn't realize was that it didn't need to be. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the pace of the war was beginning to shift alarmingly for Germany. Units that expected natural pauses in the enemy advance, those classic weeks of reorganization and resupply, simply didn't see them happen. American tanks kept appearing, artillery didn't fall silent, and attacks followed in almost uninterrupted sequence. For German officers in the field, the feeling was of fighting an enemy that never tired. Every planned retreat, every attempt to form a new defensive line, was thwarted by the speed with which the enemy reappeared, already resupplied and ready to advance again. German doctrine provided for windows of respite that simply vanished. This shattered expectation had profound effects. The German High Command began receiving increasingly contradictory reports. On paper, The Allies should have been facing catastrophic logistical bottlenecks. In practice, they were advancing faster than anticipated. The explanation made no sense within the traditional logic of European warfare. Some officers began to suspect exaggerations in the field reports. Others believed that the Americans were burning through their own resources at a suicidal rate, condemning themselves to an even greater future collapse. But that collapse never came. On the contrary, the pressure only increased, and with it, the psychological strain on troops already fighting at a numerical and air disadvantage. The human impact of this machine rarely appears on maps. Civilian drivers turned soldiers traveled dark roads, often in rain, fog, and under constant threat of attack. They slept little, ate poorly, and drove to exhaustion. Trucks broke down and were pushed to the side of the road, while others immediately took their place. There was no room for perfection, only for continuity. This silent sacrifice, far from the glamour of direct combat, was what kept the advance alive. While generals discussed strategies on maps, it was these anonymous convoys that decided whether an offensive would continue or die right there by the roadside. When the penny finally dropped for the German command, it was already too late. The realization that American logistics was not a weakness, but an overwhelming strength, came at the worst possible moment. What had previously been a source of ridicule now became a source of strategic panic. How to stop an enemy that doesn't need to stop. How to exploit logistical flaws that simply don't manifest themselves in the expected time frame. For Germany, the war was beginning to take on an impossible pace to keep up with. Each retreat cost territory that would never be recovered. Each delay was an invitation to a future encirclement. More than fuel and ammunition, what this machine provided was time. And time in war is everything. Time to exploit gaps, to disrupt defenses, to prevent the enemy from regrouping. The Allied advance was not only rapid, it was relentless. And this insistence, this refusal to stop, broke not only defensive lines, but the very logic of German strategy. The war they knew, based on clear phases of attack, pause, and reorganization, was being replaced by something new, more chaotic and brutal in its constancy. In the end, when the German generals looked back, trying to understand where everything had started to go wrong, many realized that the mistake wasn't underestimating a specific commander or an isolated battle, but an entire concept. They laughed at American logistics because they saw it through their own parameters, without understanding that they were facing a different way of waging war. It wasn't elegant nor efficient in the classical sense. It was massive, redundant, and relentless. And when they realized this, the laughter had long since ceased, replaced by the harsh reality of an enemy that never ran out of fuel to advance. If you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps this channel continue telling these stories and bringing history to life.